When concentration camps are mentioned, you immediately think of Auschwitz, Dachau, or Treblinka, names indelibly etched into the world's memory. Yet, less than 100 kilometers from Germany's capital, Berlin, there lies a silent hell reserved exclusively for women, Ravensbrück. Did you know that more than 130,000 women had their identities and dignity stripped away there? Almost without the world noticing. From the very first moment, Ravensbrück was designed to break both body and spirit through hunger, torture, and forced labor. In this video, we will expose the ruthless medical crimes, the nightmares known as the Kinder Zimmer, and the small but deadly gas chamber that killed more than 6,000 people. Prepare yourself for a journey denouncing atrocities never before told. Don't forget to click subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss the next horrifying corners of history with concentration camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, and Treblinka seared into the world's collective memory of the Holocaust. It is startling to realize that just 55 miles north of Berlin lay another, far less remembered site of Nazi brutality, Ravensbrück. Conceived in late 1938 at Heinrich Himmler's direct command, Himmler being Reichsfuhrer SS, and one of the Third Reich's most powerful figures next to Adolf Hitler, this was to be the only concentration camp built exclusively for women. Himmler envisioned it as a tool for cleansing German society of women deemed undesirable prostitutes, abortion providers, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, so-called asocials, and Jewish women. In his view, these women threatened the purity of the Volksgemeinschaft and therefore required isolation, punishment, and ruthless re-education through forced labor and rigid discipline. The chosen site, near the small village of Ravensbrück, sat hidden among dense pine forests and along a serene lake, an idyllic facade masking its grim purpose. Its remote location, nearly 90 kilometers from Berlin, ensured minimal public scrutiny, while nearby rail lines and a major highway offered logistical ease for transporting prisoners from across occupied Europe. Himmler himself was intimately familiar with the area from his frequent hunting excursions, believing that the pristine woods and waters embodied an untainted German nature that he was determined to protect from corruption. Once the decision was made, vast swaths of land were swiftly cleared by male inmates transferred from Sachsenhausen. Another camp located to the south, under SS supervision, these prisoners leveled the forest floor, erected the first wooden barracks, and erected barbed wire fences and high outer walls. Watchtowers soon punctuated the skyline, while powerful floodlights and fortified gun emplacements took shape, grim monuments to the SS's intent. Every detail was meticulously planned to transform the site into a hell for women, where over 130,000 female prisoners, most of whom would never survive to see freedom again, would endure unthinkable suffering, humiliation, and trauma. From the outset, Ravensbrück's design reflected the Nazis' calculated cruelty. The camp's layout enforced strict segregation and perpetual surveillance, double-fenced perimeters, overlapping fields of fire, and sparse guard paths ensured that any attempt at escape would be met with instant, lethal force. The barracks themselves, hastily constructed with thin timber walls and inadequate heating, would later become overcrowded cells of misery, where women shivered through brutal winters and sweltered under relentless summer sun. Punishment bunkers, medical labs, and punishment blocks were built alongside factories where inmates would be forced to toil for 12 hours a day, often undernourished, exposed to disease, and subjected to the whims of sadistic guards. By the time the camp commenced operations in May 1939, its infrastructure had been purpose-built to dehumanize and break its victims. Yet even as those first transports of women arrived, many screaming in confusion and terror, the full extent of Ravensbrück's dark mission would only become clear in the months and years to follow. From the moment of its construction, this remote outpost of the SS stood as a chilling testament to the regime's willingness to engineer gender-specific genocide. Shrouded in secrecy yet fueled by a calculated ideology of hate, in May 1939, less than 4 months before the outbreak of World War II, the first transport of 867 women arrived at Ravensbrück, a camp few outside the SS hierarchy even knew existed. Most were German. With a smaller contingent of Austrian prisoners, none had any inkling of what awaited them. When the overcrowded train ground to a halt on the sidetrack, snarling SS guard dogs lunged at the carriages, and barking officers herded the bewildered women down metal steps. The sharp staccato of rifle butts striking boots echoed in the early morning air, mingling with the acrid tang of fear. Shoved forward, the prisoners stumbled into a wide assembly yard, framed by tall iron gates and 2 rows of drab gray barracks. The fresh scent of cut timber and damp earth should have hinted at new construction, but for these women, it heralded something far more sinister, a landscape engineered for cruelty. No sooner had they set foot on solid ground than their meager belongings were stripped away. Valuables, personal papers, even tiny keepsakes carried for comfort were snatched by unsympathetic SS women and deposited into crates bound for the camp's central depot. Stripped of coats, scarves, photographs, and anything resembling warmth or familiarity, each prisoner felt a psychological blow. Their names were crossed off the books, replaced by a number crudely stitched onto the breast of a coarse regulation issue smock. That number, sewn hastily by frightened camp officials, became their sole identifier, a stark announcement that each woman was now property of the SS. Whispers rippled through the assembled group. What crime have we committed to deserve this? But no response came, only the cold glares of guards and the snapping of dogs' jaws. Humiliation escalated into outright degradation with the so-called intake ceremony, without regard for age or physical condition. Every woman was ordered to disrobe completely, in full view of barking hounds and uniformed watchers. They stood naked on the cold ground, as SS officers, male and female, conducted invasive body searches, probing hair, clothing seams, and even the most private areas for contraband. When the searches concluded, their heads were shaved bare, a public act of dehumanization that left them physically exposed and emotionally shattered. Next came the issuance of a single coarse dress, no underwear, no shoes, and a solitary metal bowl. The total extent of their possessions, stripped of boots, stockings, and all personal items, many tried to cling to the faint hope that some small comfort would remain, only to find that even hope had been taken. In that moment, Ravensbrück's true purpose became clear, not merely to imprison, but to obliterate identity and dignity. The women, cold, naked, and numbered, were then marched toward the barracks, each step carrying them deeper into the camp's unforgiving routine. With nothing but a thin dress and a metal bowl to their name, they faced a future defined by forced labor, brutal discipline, and the constant terror of the unknown. And so began their ordeal in Ravensbrück, a place where individuality was erased. Suffering was systematic, and the simple act of survival became a daily triumph over calculated cruelty. By September 1939, as World War II engulfed Europe, Ravensbrück's Inmate population swelled precipitously. Women were deported from Poland, France, Czechoslovakia, and other occupied territories, their numbers soon surpassing the camp's original capacity. In response, the SS doubled the living quarters, expanding from 16 to 32 wooden barracks, and erected additional workshops, punishment blocks, and a rudimentary medical facility. Despite this infrastructure, genuine healthcare remained virtually non-existent. Within a few years, tens of thousands of women had passed through Ravensbrück's gates, the vast majority never to be released. The camp's infamous welcome ceremony was designed to break spirits in the first 24 hours. New arrivals, shoulder to shoulder, were forced to stand motionless without sitting or speaking. Whether under the scorching summer sun or amid winter's biting cold, any woman who collapsed risked brutal reprisals. Guards hurled stones, unleashed snarling dogs, or dragged victims by their arms across the hard ground. This ritual of endurance, alternately cruel and calculated, delivered a stark message in Ravensbrück. Human life counted for nothing more than a statistic. Once the initial ordeal ended, more systematic procedures began. Groups of about 200 women were herded into single-person bunk frames, turned triple-deckers, each berth barely large enough for one. Overcrowding and filth reigned. Latrines overflowed. Communal wash areas were scant, and outbreaks of typhus, dysentery, and scabies spread unchecked. Meal rations consisted of thin, watery soup and stale, often moldy bread, providing a fraction of the caloric intake needed for survival. Medical staff were overwhelmed or indifferent, leaving many injuries and illnesses untreated despite their rapidly deteriorating health. Prisoners were compelled to labor in the camp's factories and workshops for up to 12 hours a day. Elderly women, adolescents, and even expectant mothers were assigned the same grueling schedules as able-bodied adults. Tasks ranged from manufacturing munitions components to repairing railway lines, all performed beneath the watchful eyes of armed SS overseers. Any sign of slowing or fatigue invited harsh punishment, extra roll calls, solitary confinement, or physical beatings. Over time, the constant deprivation of food, rest, and medical care, combined with back-breaking work and merciless discipline, drove many inmates to the brink of collapse. Mental anguish paralleled physical suffering, the hopeless monotony of endless labor, the ever-present threat of violence, and the sight of fellow prisoners succumbing to disease created an atmosphere of pervasive despair. Some women lost the will to eat, others drifted into delirium. In this environment engineered to strip away identity, dignity, and hope, survival itself became an act of defiance. Thus, Ravensbrück's expansion from a modest facility into an industrialized center of oppression stands as a chilling testament to the Nazi regime's cruelty. The camp's capacity to enclose, torment, and dehumanize tens of thousands of women under the veneer of minimal care and forced rehabilitation underscores the calculated brutality that lay at the heart of its operations for those who endured its horrors. Each day was measured in shattered bodies and broken spirits, and the very act of lasting another sunrise became a triumph over systematic cruelty. Life at Ravensbrück was governed by an ironclad regime of discipline. Each day began at exactly 3:20 in the morning with a shrill whistle that pierced the darkness. Groggy prisoners, roused from their fitful slumber, were compelled to dress by the dim glow of floodlights. No one was allowed. Even a moment's hesitation, slippers were forbidden, and only the thin, regulation-issue smock could be donned. Any delay was met with barking orders and the threat of a whip, ensuring that lethargy had no place in this camp. Once dressed, the women assembled shoulder to shoulder in the frozen pre-dawn air or under the sweltering summer sun for the daily roll call. Conversation was strictly prohibited, and even the slightest breach of protocol, an exchanged glance with a fellow prisoner or a momentary wobble in formation, could result in a barrage of rifle butts or a brutal lash from the camp guards. Many collapsed from exhaustion, hunger, or inclement weather, but very few were permitted to rest. If a woman fell, she risked being dragged violently across the cobblestones or set upon by snarling guard dogs. Their clothing offered little protection against the elements. The single-layer dress, often torn or stained, served as a stark reminder of their helplessness. Underwear, shoes, and personal garments had been confiscated on arrival, leaving feet blistered against rough ground and bodies chilled to the bone. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Minor wounds festered. Respiratory infections went untreated, and outbreaks of typhus and dysentery spread unchecked through the barracks. The sustained deprivation of basic health needs transformed illness into a death sentence for many. Food rations dwindled over time. Morning and evening meals consisted of watery soup and stale, moldy bread barely enough to sustain forced labor and the shock of daily roll calls. Calories grew scarcer as the war dragged on, and the specter of starvation loomed over every barrack. Women scavenged scraps, shared morsels in secret, or attempted to trade labor for additional portions, all to stave off the hollow pain of hunger that gnawed relentlessly at their weakened bodies. Among these hardened survivors, newborns were an especially tragic presence. Children born within the camp walls arrived already disadvantaged mothers, themselves emaciated, could produce little to no milk. The so-called Kinder Zimmer, a bare dormitory for infants, became a chamber of death, where feeble cries faded into silence within days. Without blankets, proper nutrition, or medical attention, most babies perished, their young lives extinguished long before the camp gates would ever open for them. In this environment of systematic dehumanization, identity was a casualty. True names were erased from the camp registry and replaced by cold numbers, crudely stitched onto the breast of each smock. Official records maintained no personal histories, only digits denoting each woman's reduction to property of the SS. Stripped of all markers of individuality, prisoners found themselves lost in a labyrinth of violence, barely able to recall the contours of their former lives by reducing human beings to mere statistics. Ravensbrück's regime extinguished hope. Survival became a matter of endurance through monotonous cruelty, the shock of each morning whistle, the terror of roll call, the ache of starvation, and the numbness of constant fear. In that world, freedom existed only as a distant memory, and the faintest spark of resistance flickered amid the relentless erasure of personhood. One of the most terrifying aspects of life at Ravensbrück was the squad of female guards, over 150 women dressed in gray uniforms, black leather boots, and carrying leather whips or wooden clubs. Prisoners dubbed them the Black Crows for their dark attire and merciless behavior. Many of these women had been ordinary factory workers, secretaries, or housewives before volunteering for the SS. Yet within weeks of donning the uniform, they morphed into ruthless overseers, matching or even surpassing their male counterparts in cruelty. Dodatha Binns, for example, was infamous for beating prisoners to death with stones or her bare hands. Maria Mandel went on to serve at Auschwitz, where she participated in selections for the gas chambers and supervised punishments. Elsewhere, the guard nicknamed the Hyena, Irma Grafe, used her dog to terrorize inmates, her actions so abhorrent that she was ultimately sentenced to death for war crimes. Alongside the relentless discipline enforced by the Black Crows, forced labor served as the camp's principal form of punishment, situated just beyond the barracks. A Siemens factory employed prisoners to assemble components for weapons, electronic devices, and even rocket systems. Inmates labored under constant SS supervision, often 12 hours a day or more, without adequate nutrition or breaks. The assembly lines operated with machine-like efficiency. Women stamped out parts, soldered circuits, and tested intricate mechanisms as guards paced overhead, ready to whip anyone who slowed or faltered. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease turned each work shift into a harrowing ordeal, with falling asleep on the line, sometimes resulting in severe beatings to wake up the victim. For those deemed compliant or useful, service in the camp brothel represented a so-called privilege rather than a punishment, a grotesque irony. Selected women were sent to operate within a facility designed to reward male prisoners who met production quotas. Once inside, they faced new forms of exploitation rather than crafting munitions. They were forced into sexual servitude under the watchful eye of the SS. Although presented as a reprieve from backbreaking factory labor, this assignment offered no choice and carried its own horrors: emotional abuse, violence, and the stigma of collaboration. The unending cycle of humiliation and forced labor rendered Ravensbrück a living hell. Many women collapsed from illness, starvation, or savage beatings. Their weakened bodies, unable to withstand another day's toil, barracks overflowed with the sick and dying, and camp medics, if they existed at all, offered only rudimentary or delayed treatment. Yet amid this sea of suffering, small acts of solidarity and hope emerged. Prisoners would secretly share meager scraps of food, fashion makeshift dressings for wounds, or discreetly warn one another of approaching guards. These gestures of compassion, though perilous, fostered a fragile network of support that helped some women endure. Despite the SS's efforts to strip them of dignity and identity, a handful of inmates clung to the belief that they could outlast the terror. They whispered prayers, exchanged knitted scraps as tokens of friendship, and passed along news of the war's progress in hushed tones. In those brief moments of shared humanity, Ravensbrück's captives found the inner strength to resist the dehumanizing machinery around them. It was this quiet defiance, often invisible to their oppressors, that offered the faintest glimmer of hope beneath the camp's shadow of despair. In 1942, Ravensbrück became the grim theater for some of the most horrifying medical experiments ever conceived by the SS under the direction of Dr. T. Karl Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's personal physician. 86 female prisoners, predominantly Polish political detainees, were selected as lab rabbits for tests of sulfonamide, an early form of antibiotic. There was no pretense of humanitarian concern. These women were viewed merely as disposable subjects. Under Gebhardt's supervision, SS doctors and their assistants inflicted deliberate wounds to muscles, tendons, and bones, severing flesh with surgical instruments to mimic battlefield injuries. Into these open wounds, they embedded shards of glass, wood splinters, and contaminated soil, then injected pathogenic bacteria to provoke life-threatening infections. Within days, the bodies of these test patients swelled grotesquely. High fevers raged, tissues ulcerated, and gangene took hold. Many victims suffered necrosis severe enough to require amputation of limbs or joints, leaving them permanently disabled. Despite the excruciating pain, no meaningful analgesics were administered. At best, they received placebo tablets so underdosed as to be entirely ineffective. Some women languished for weeks as the infections festered, their cries unanswered, until they succumbed to septic shock. Others were executed immediately after the experiments concluded, a calculated measure to conceal the SS's crimes from any external investigator. Yet, amid this orchestrated cruelty, acts of extraordinary courage and solidarity emerged among the prisoners. Fellow inmates, themselves weakened by forced labor and starvation, risked their own safety to hide the surviving lab rabbits. In the dead of night, they covertly exchanged identification numbers, sewed false insignias onto uniforms, and smuggled the wounded women between barracks to protect them from discovery. These selfless efforts required meticulous planning and unshakable resolve. A single informant or SS patrol could spell immediate death for both rescuer and rescued. The sight of women subjected to dehumanizing dissection, as if they were mere objects, and yet refusing to surrender their compassion, stands as one of the most harrowing yet inspiring chapters in Ravensbrück's history. Under the veneer of scientific advancement, the camp's authorities perpetrated unspeakable brutality, violating every principle of medical ethics. However, the prisoners' clandestine resistance preserved not only lives but also their shared humanity. They communicated hope through whispered prayers, clandestine notes, and the simple act of tending each other's wounds. This juxtaposition of barbaric experimentation and resilient solidarity renders the Ravensbrück medical atrocities uniquely poignant. The victims' unimaginable suffering, orchestrated by those sworn to heal, underscores the depths of Nazi depravity. Simultaneously, the solidarity of the prisoners embodies the unyielding strength of the human spirit, revealing that even within the depths of calculated evil, compassion can flourish. Their legacy endures as a powerful reminder medical knowledge, when untethered from ethics and humanity, becomes a weapon of atrocity. While the smallest acts of kindness can illuminate the darkest corners of history, by 1944, Ravensbrück's population of pregnant women had swelled due to the continuous influx of new prisoners, forcing the SS to confront the logistical nightmare of unwanted births. Until then, the Nazi regime had strictly prohibited childbearing within the camps, but with overcrowding at its peak, they grudgingly permitted deliveries only to consign the infants to certain death. The facility known as the Kinder Zimmer, or children's room, was established ostensibly as a neonatal ward. Yet in reality, it was a bare, freezing chamber lined with empty steel cribs, no blankets, no warming lamps, no nursing supplies, only iron frames and concrete floors. As each newborn emerged into this cruel environment, the child's first breath marked entry into a life of acute malnutrition. Mothers, themselves emaciated by forced labor, starvation, and disease, were physiologically incapable of producing sufficient milk. Even those who clung to hope by attempting to breastfeed were denied increased rations or rest. The camp's draconian rules offered no allowances for maternal recovery. Deprived of nutrition and warmth, the infants withered rapidly, limbs grew gaunt, skin shriveled into wrinkles, eyes sunken into hollow sockets. Their volleys of plaintive cries echoed through the barrack corridors. A fleeting protest against the SS's inhumane policies before dwindling into silence. When a baby finally succumbed, SS guards removed the tiny body without ritual or mercy, wrapped in coarse burlap sacks, or simply carried away by gloved hands. The infant corpses were disposed of alongside those of adult inmates reduced to nameless refuse. Mothers, haunted by the agonizing wails they could neither comfort nor smother, returned to their grueling work assignments, burdened by the constant fear that their child might already be gone. Each morning's roll call carried the added dread of discovering yet another blank space where their baby should have been. In the shadow of this silent atrocity, some women managed small acts of compassion. They covertly shared fragments of their meager bread or furtively cradled each other's infants, offering the slightest warmth against the steel cribs. A few older women, too weak themselves to nurse, gathered to comfort nearby newborns, pressing their ragged coats around little bodies to stave off hypothermia. These gestures, however modest, carried immense risk. Any SS overseer who witnessed a maternal embrace could lash, beat, or send both mother and helper to solitary confinement. Despite these acts of solidarity, the Kinder Zimmer remained a death chamber. The camp command viewed the elimination of these infants as a solution to overcrowding and a means to further its ideological war on undesirable lives. In their eyes, even the most innocent were enemies of the Reich. The deliberate neglect, starvation, exposure, and isolation functioned as a silent execution, devoid of gas chambers or firing squads. Yet equally lethal, as a symbol, the Kinder Zimmer stands among the darkest facets of Ravensbrück. It transformed the most defenseless into targets, stripped newborns of the most fundamental right, life, without fanfare. The SS's policy of forced birth, followed by systematic abandonment, epitomizes the regime's capacity to dehumanize across generations, condemning even its youngest victims to an inexorable fate of starvation and despair. By early 1945, as the Soviet Red Army prepared to advance into northern Germany, the SS at Ravensbrück faced an urgent dilemma. Tens of thousands of sick, elderly, and disabled women and children clogged the camp's infirmaries and barracks. In a final, grim bid to eliminate these useless eaters before liberation, SS authorities ordered the construction of a clandestine gas chamber adjacent to the camp crematorium. Disguised as a shower block and lacking any warning signs, the small structure was erected in haste by male prisoners brought in expressly for the task. Flash floods of floodlights and guard towers soon framed the new building, ensuring no escape and no external scrutiny. From January through April of 1945, the gas chamber claimed the lives of more than 6,000 victims. Each installation began under the pretense of a delousing shower groups of up to 180 women and children were herded inside, believing they would be cleaned. Once the heavy door clanged shut, the SS released Zyklon B, an insecticidal cyanide gas previously used at larger extermination camps. Within minutes, the chamber filled with invisible poison, extinguishing lives in a silent, systematic purge. Victims collapsed en masse, their lungs filled with burning agony, eyes glazing over as the gas worked its lethal alchemy. Immediately following the gassing, SS guards and capos dragged the bodies from the room and transferred them to the roaring crematorium ovens just steps away. There was no ceremony. No record of individual deaths. Corpses were reduced to ash within hours, erasing all physical evidence of the atrocity. The proximity of the gas chamber to the crematorium ensured a seamless, self-contained framework of destruction. Even the prisoner grave detail, forced to shovel bones and cinders into mass graves or scatter them in nearby fields, was overseen by armed guards who threatened summary execution for any hint of compassion. Although smaller in scale than the purpose-built killing factories at Auschwitz or Treblinka, Ravensbrück's gas chamber was no less barbaric. Its late addition underscored the SS's determination to eradicate witnesses before enemy forces could arrive. Whereas the sprawling death camps employed vast gas chambers capable of processing thousands daily, the Ravensbrück facility operated on a more intimate but equally vicious level, targeting those deemed too weak to exploit as laborers. This frenzied endgame killings revealed the depths of Nazi ruthlessness even as defeat loomed. The regime refused to abandon its genocidal ideology. In those final months, the gas chamber at Ravensbrück stood as a silent testament to systematic annihilation, its very existence hidden from public view. Known only to camp staff and coerced builders, epitomized the calculated cruelty of the Nazi death machine. Here, in a forest glade north of Berlin, the SS implemented one last measure of terror, reducing helpless women and children to statistics and smoke. The chamber's small size only amplified its horror, proving that the will to destroy need not rely on grand architecture or industrial capacity. A single sealed room and a handful of guards could suffice to erase humanity. Ultimately, the gas chamber's brief but deadly tenure revealed the unwavering commitment of the Reich to final solutions, right up to its disintegration under the Red Army's guns. Despite having their names erased and their dignity stripped away, numerous prisoners at Ravensbrück refused to succumb to despair. In the dim glow of stolen candles, small groups gathered nightly to hold clandestine lessons in makeshift classrooms hidden within barrack corners. There, women shared lessons in foreign languages, literature, and art knowledge, wielded as a powerful antidote to the crushing monotony of camp life. These secret curricula rekindled hope, reminding each student that the world beyond the fences still existed. Within the Siemens factory, adjacent to the barracks, a cadre of skilled laborers quietly transformed their work into acts of resistance, tasked with assembling components for weapons, electronic devices, and even rocket assemblies. They deliberately introduced subtle defects, misaligned circuits, improperly fitted rivets, and faulty wiring. Each delayed shipment meant that Nazi armaments units faced critical shortages at the front lines. Though seemingly minor, these acts of industrial sabotage cost the regime precious time and resources, offering a measure of protection to Allied soldiers fighting far from those pine forests. Forging identity papers became another lifeline for those facing imminent transfer to extermination camps. Using scraps of paper smuggled from administrative offices, prisoners meticulously replicated SS forms, stamping faux signatures and dates to conceal real names. These counterfeit documents allowed some women to slip beneath the SS's radar during roll calls, avoiding the dreaded transport lists that signaled a one-way journey to death camps further east. For each successful forgery, a life was spared, if only for a few more harrowing weeks. Perhaps the most daring communication strategy involved the use of invisible ink derived from prisoners' own urine. Messages, smuggled onto innocuous letters between forced labor assignments, detailed the horrors of medical experiments and mass killings unfolding at Ravensbrück. Hidden between layers of innocuous text, these letters passed SS censorship before reaching contacts in Poland, the Vatican, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Upon receipt, they fueled international outrage, prompting inquiries that momentarily unsettled camp authorities and offered a glimmer of accountability to the outside world. Beyond intellectual resistance, prisoners found solace in crafting physical tokens of humanity, gathered from leftover scraps of uniform fabric, bits of thread, and discarded packaging. Inmates fashioned rudimentary dolls, intricate bracelets, and small cloth sculptures. Each handmade item served as both a treasured keepsake and a mental diversion, mementos of identity in a place designed to erase individuality. Sharing these trinkets with one another fortified bonds of solidarity, as each piece symbolized the assertion, we are still human in the face of systematic dehumanization. These acts of compassion and creativity carried profound risk. Discovery by SS guards could bring brutal reprisals, extra punishments, solitary confinement, or death. Yet the women persisted, driven by an unspoken oath to preserve dignity in the darkest of times. Their nightly gatherings, whispered lessons, and covert artistry fostered a fragile community of resilience within the camp's oppressive architecture. Such moments of mutual support became pillars of survival. Ultimately, these covert networks of education, sabotage, and artistry wove a tapestry of defiance across Ravensbrück. They demonstrated that terror alone could not extinguish the human spirit. Each act, whether a lesson taught under flickering lamplight or a keel-leaking gas chamber components, served as testimony to the prisoners' unyielding resolve. In the end, their collective resistance affirmed a simple yet profound truth. Even within the most brutal of regimes, compassion and courage can flourish, sustaining hope against overwhelming odds. Late April 1945, the Soviet Red Army finally burst through Ravensbrück's barbed wire perimeter and discovered fewer than 3,500 women still alive, emaciated, gravely ill, and many unable to stand outside the barracks. The forests bore silent witness to tens of thousands of bodies left from the SS's desperate death marches, in which prisoners were forced into the woods and executed en masse as the regime tried to eliminate witnesses. Unlike the liberation of camps in the western zones, no Allied news crews captured this moment. There were no iconic images of survivors wrapped in blankets. No photographs of German civilians compelled to confront the horrors they had ignored. This muted unveiling consigned Ravensbrück to a kind of historical obscurity, a forgotten camp, overshadowed by the publicity surrounding Auschwitz, Dachau, and Treblinka. The tragedy deepened for many of the women who survived to taste freedom. With no protective structures or advocacy in place, a significant number were subjected to sexual violence at the hands of Soviet soldiers, adding layers of trauma to bodies already ravaged by starvation and brutality. After the Russians departed, survivors faced a world that was often unwilling to acknowledge their suffering. Families and communities, unprepared for the stigma and emotional fallout, frequently turned away. Returning prisoners, many women found their hometowns indifferent to their stories. Some were met with suspicion, others with silent avoidance. This collective amnesia compounded the injustice of their ordeal, rendering their experiences invisible even to those who should have offered solace. A handful of courageous survivors stepped forward as witnesses in post-war war crimes trials, determined to bear testimony against former SS guards and doctors, yet these frail voices often drowned out by geopolitical tensions, and the onset of the Cold War achieved only partial accountability. For the majority, justice remained elusive. They carried the weight of unspoken horrors for the rest of their lives, burdened by years of forced labor, medical torture, and the murder of friends and children. On the body of a young girl who did not live to see liberation, rescuers discovered a final plea penned in trembling handwriting. O Lord, remember not only the men and women of goodwill, but also those of ill will, but do not remember all the suffering they inflicted on us. Remember the fruits we have borne thanks to this suffering. This poignant message, smuggled out of Ravensbrück, testifies to the prisoners' enduring compassion and courage. It stands as a reminder that, even amid unthinkable cruelty, they cultivated loyalty, humility, and the greatness of heart that alone can transform suffering into forgiveness. Yet Ravensbrück's fate as a camp of shadows poses urgent questions for future generations. Why has its memory faded? While other camps remain seared into public consciousness, perhaps it was the absence of liberating footage. The lack of towering gas chambers to provide stark cinematic imagery, or maybe gender bias played a role. As histories of male-dominated battlefields and camps overshadowed the unique suffering of women, it may also be that Ravensbrück's method of slow, systematic destruction defied the simple narratives that emerged in the post-war era. Whatever the reasons, the story of Ravensbrück insists on being remembered a testament to human endurance and a warning that evil, when left unchecked, can target anyone born or unborn, armed or defenseless. Just before she died, a young girl of about 12 or 13 managed to scrawl a final message on a scrap of paper and hide it up the sleeve of her faded uniform. The letter, written in trembling lines, was a heartfelt prayer addressed to God. Remember not only the men and women of goodwill, but also those of ill will. But do not remember all the suffering they have inflicted upon us. Remember instead the fruits we have borne through this suffering, concealed among her garments. It traveled through the camp's dark corridors by the hands of brave fellow prisoners. Each woman who carried that note risked immediate punishment or worse if caught by the SS. Yet, without that girl's last words, the world might never have heard the final voice of an innocent victim. This child's testimony did more than document atrocity. It became a manifesto of solidarity and compassion, born in a place designed to extinguish both. The letter crystallized the prisoners' shared resolve. Even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, they would not abandon one another. It circulated among the barracks, copied in secret. A beacon of unity in a landscape marked by barbed wire and despair. It spoke of forgiveness, resilience, and the capacity for goodness to emerge from the deepest darkness values that transcended the camp's walls and chained gates. Such defiance was not limited to words. In the dim glow of rationed candlelight, women whispered lessons on language and literature, using knowledge as a balm for their wounded spirits. In the Siemens factory, skilled laborers covertly sabotaged weapon components, misaligning metal fittings, mismarking electrical circuits, and marring rocket parts, understanding that even a small delay might spare lives on distant battlefields. Elsewhere, prisoners with access to paperwork crafted false identity cards, slipping them into the hands of those marked for transfer, shaving precious hours off SS records and, in some cases, saving fellow inmates from deportation to death camps. Perhaps the most ingenious form of resistance involved the use of urine as invisible ink, smuggled letters, penned with this secreted medium, slipped past SS censors and reached allies beyond the camp. Detailed accounts of medical torture, forced labor, and mass executions found their way to Poland, the Vatican, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Those letters sparked international outrage, forcing inquiries that briefly unsettled camp authorities and offered fleeting hope of intervention beyond intellectual and logistical subversion. Prisoners created fragile tokens to sustain morale miniature dolls stitched from scraps of uniform cloth, braided bracelets woven from leftover threads, and small fabric effigies symbolizing freedom. Each handcrafted piece carried the affirmation, "We remain human," passed quietly between women. These tokens reinforced bonds of empathy and provided mental refuge from the relentless grind of hunger, sickness, and violence. The girl's final prayer, folded into a blood-stained sleeve, united these myriad acts of courage. It issued a direct challenge to future generations: do not let our suffering fade into oblivion. Remember the atrocities we endured, but also remember the compassion we nurtured, those fruits of suffering that stand as testament to our humanity. In that simple note lies a warning and a promise. Even when stripped of identity and dignity, people can choose empathy over cruelty and solidarity over despair. It is our responsibility to carry forward that legacy of hope and remembrance. Unlike Auschwitz or Dachau, Ravensbrück lacked the dramatic liberation footage that would forever emblazon those camps in global consciousness. There were no helmeted American soldiers advancing into the compound, no stunned German bystanders forced to witness the horrors they had ignored, nor any newsreel cameras rolling as ragged survivors stumbled toward freedom wrapped in tattered blankets. Instead, the Red Army's arrival at Ravensbrück in late April 1945 was met with grim silence. Soviet infantry quietly secured the gates, finding fewer than 3,500 living prisoners, frail, sick, and many unable to stand, in fields strewn with the bodies of those killed on forced death marches. Yet no Western correspondents were present. No dispatches carried images of joy or relief back to Allied capitals. The camp's story, liberated behind the emerging Iron Curtain, was thus omitted from the front pages and newsreels that shaped post-war memory in Western Europe and America. In the immediate post-war years, the dominant narrative of the Holocaust coalesced around the extermination of Jews in the purpose-built death factories of Eastern Europe. Auschwitz, with its sprawling crematoria, Treblinka, with its railway sidings of death, and Dachau, as the prototype camp liberated by American troops, provided stark visual evidence of Nazi genocide. Ravensbrück's method of oppression, slow starvation, forced labor, medical brutality, and a late addition of a small gas chamber did not produce those iconic shock images of piles of bodies or liberation parades. As a result, Ravensbrück struggled to find a place in textbooks and documentaries that prioritized clear, graphic examples of industrialized mass murder. Moreover, Ravensbrück's status as a women's camp further marginalized its history in the early scholarship and storytelling of the Holocaust. In a field dominated by male historians and former soldiers, the experiences of women both as victims and as coerced perpetrators were often sidelined. Accounts of male political prisoners, Jewish men, and Soviet POWs took precedence, leaving the suffering and resilience of thousands of female inmates underreported. Ravensbrück's unique cruelty, from the Kinder Zimmer to the medical experiments, was thus relegated to footnotes or confined to specialized studies on gender and the Holocaust, limiting its exposure to wider audiences. The onset of the Cold War exacerbated this marginalization. As Europe split into East and West, camps liberated by Soviet forces, particularly those on the Eastern Front, fell under the sway of Soviet historiography, which emphasized communist resistance and downplayed the singularly Nazi nature of the crime. Western historians, wary of Soviet propaganda, and focused on camps within their own zones of liberation, paid scant attention to Ravensbrück. Academic conferences, museum exhibits, and survivor testimonies coalesced around Auschwitz-Birkenau and Western liberated camps, leaving the Northern Forest camp largely in the shadows. Without the visceral imagery of liberation or the political utility of male-centric narratives, Ravensbrück's CX story faded into the background of public memory. Its methods of slow dehumanization, while no less lethal than mass gassing, did not fit neatly into the compelling visual motifs that drive media coverage. Furthermore, the camp's location behind the Iron Curtain discouraged Western journalists from seeking first-hand accounts during the tense early decades of the Cold War. As a result, Ravensbrück became, in effect, the forgotten camp, a place of immense suffering whose witness was muffled by geopolitics, gender bias, and the absence of iconic documentation. Thus, the tale of Ravensbrück raises crucial questions for contemporary remembrance. How do we ensure that all voices, particularly those of women and of camps beyond the primary narratives, are heard? What responsibilities do historians and media producers bear in revisiting forgotten corners of atrocity? And finally, how can modern audiences reconcile the camp's slow-burning horrors with the more dramatic spectacles that have come to define the Holocaust in collective memory? Remembering Ravensbrück demands that we look beyond the familiar images and acknowledge the full scope of Nazi brutality, wherever and against whomever it was inflicted. Most people, when they think of the Holocaust, envision the extermination camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor designed expressly to annihilate Jewish populations on an industrial scale. This singular focus on the final solution against Europe's Jews, while tragically justified by the overwhelming evidence of genocide, can obscure a broader reality at Ravensbrück. Well over 80% of the inmates were not Jewish, but political prisoners, communists, socialists, resistance fighters from occupied nations, Jehovah's Witnesses, so-called socials, and even prostitutes made up the vast majority of the camp's population. This stark demographic contrast challenges the simplistic association of all concentration and extermination camps with the systematic killing of Jews alone. In place of gas chambers designed for rapid mass murder, Ravensbrück's authorities employed starvation, forced labor, and medical torture. Yet it was the identities of the prisoners that fundamentally complicated the camp's narrative. Women, whose only crime was political dissent or nonconformity, were packed into overcrowded barracks, enduring the same brutality as any Jewish prisoner. Their presence forces us to reconsider the scope of Nazi persecution. It was not limited to racial ideology, but extended to silence any form of opposition. Religious difference, or social deviance. Equally significant was the inclusion of Roma women, Catholic nuns, and members of other religious minorities within Ravensbrück's walls. Their stories resist easy categorization, for they straddled multiple axes of victimhood: racial, political, and moral. A Roma inmate might suffer racial prejudice that overlapped with accusations of asocial behavior. A nun could be targeted both for her faith and for perceived ideological resistance. The result was a labyrinthine tapestry of persecution, where race, politics, and morality interwove to create a uniquely complex theater of cruelty. This diversity of victim groups made Ravensbrück difficult to incorporate into the dominant post-war narrative of the Holocaust, which early Western historians and filmmakers often distilled into a single, horrifying arc: the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews through gas chambers and crematoria. Such a narrative, while accurate for camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, failed to capture the multifaceted brutality experienced by non-Jewish women at Ravensbrück. To do justice to their suffering requires a multidimensional approach, one that integrates political history, sociological analysis, and the psychology of female imprisonment under a totalitarian regime. Moreover, the convergence of these varied categories of persecution underscores the Nazi regime's broader intent to impose absolute conformity. It was not enough to eliminate racial enemies. The SS sought to purge any individual or group deemed a threat to the Volksgemeinschaft, whether through political ideology, religious belief, or even perceived moral laxity. In Ravensbrück, this translated into a cross-cutting genocide, where the lines between victim categories blurred and overlapped. A single inmate might find herself targeted as a communist, then further penalized for being an unmarried mother or for rejected conversion to Nazism. Understanding Ravensbrück therefore demands that we expand our conception of the Holocaust beyond the death factory model. We must recognize how political, religious, and social dimensions intersected to produce a camp whose very existence was predicated on eradicating all forms of nonconformity, racial, ideological, and moral alike. Only by embracing this complexity can we fully appreciate the depth of suffering endured by the camp's predominantly non-Jewish prisoners, and honor their memory as integral to the full history of Nazi atrocities. Unlike the purpose-built extermination camps of Treblinka and Sobibor, where gas chambers and crematoria were integral from the outset, Ravensbrück employed a slow-kill approach. Prisoners endured grueling forced labor, extreme deprivation, rampant disease, and brutal medical experimentation rather than immediate mass gassing. Women were worked to exhaustion in factories and healing huts alike, given meager rations of watery soup and stale bread, and exposed to winter's freezing winds and summer's blistering heat in thin, single-layer uniforms. Infectious diseases such as typhus and dysentery spread unchecked through overcrowded barracks, while SS doctors conducted cruel experiments under the guise of scientific research. These methods systematically depleted victims' health over weeks or months. breaking bodies and spirits through attrition instead of annihilation in minutes. This incremental form of destruction failed to produce the kind of dramatic, visceral imagery that defines public memory of the Holocaust. Newsreels and photographs of survivors emerging from gas chambers, film footage of blanket-wrapped prisoners, and the shocking spectacle of liberated death camps galvanized global outrage and shaped the post-war narrative. Ravensbrück's quiet horrors, women fading away in the barracks. Suffering hidden behind barbed wire offered no such stark tableau. The camp's victims wasted slowly, their deaths unrecorded by liberating camera crews, their final moments unseen by the world. In the aftermath of the war, historians and journalists gravitated toward events with clear visual evidence, leaving gradual, silent atrocities to slip from collective attention. Compounding this invisibility was the gendered bias of early Holocaust scholarship and reportage. In the years following liberation, most historians, filmmakers, and war correspondents were men, often former soldiers or political figures whose primary focus lay on male-dominated battlefronts and the camps they helped free. Women's experiences in particular, those of female prisoners in women-only camps, were viewed as ancillary, a footnote in a broader history of male suffering. Ravensbrück, therefore, was relegated to the status of a secondary camp, its narrative deemed too peripheral to warrant in-depth study. The voices of its predominantly female inmates, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, and other undesirables were seldom central to the emerging historiography. This intersection of a slow-burn atrocity and a male-centric historical gaze rendered Ravensbrück remarkably easy to overlook without the incendiary impact of immediate, large-scale extermination footage, and without champions to amplify women's stories in post-war discourse. The camp's realities faded into the background. Ravensbrück appeared only in passing references in textbooks or in specialized studies of gender and genocide. Its unique combination of forced labor, starvation, disease, and medical torture simply did not fit the streamlined narrative of industrialized Jewish extermination that came to dominate Holocaust memory. As a result, Ravensbrück's victims, many of whom perished through erosion of health, rather than a single act of mass murder, remained voiceless in the grand narrative of the Holocaust. Only in recent decades have scholars begun to excavate the camp's hidden histories, giving overdue attention to its predominantly female population and the subtle, sustained mechanisms of their genocide. By recognizing the limitations of earlier storytelling, both in its reliance on shocking imagery and its narrow focus on male-centered experiences, we can begin to restore Ravensbrück to its rightful place in Holocaust history, honoring the slow, inexorable suffering endured by thousands of women. Future generations must confront a troubling question: why has the story of the women of Ravensbrück remained shrouded in silence? Partly, this erasure stems from a lack of dramatic imagery. Unlike the vast gas chambers of Auschwitz or Treblinka, Ravensbrück's atrocities unfolded incrementally through forced labor, starvation, disease, and medical experiments, offering no single, searing photograph to galvanize public outrage. Moreover, the camp's method of slow genocide evaporated victims over weeks or months, rather than through a single, instantaneous act. Such gradual suffering rarely compels the same visceral reaction as a tragic moment frozen in time, leaving Ravensbrück's women to vanish without cinematic spectacle. Equally significant was the deliberate shaping of Holocaust history to prioritize the Jewish genocide. While the extermination of 6 million Jews was rightly at the center of global remembrance, this focus sometimes marginalized other victim groups. Ravensbrück housed primarily political prisoners, asocials, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, and other persecuted women. Over 80% were non-Jewish. This complex demographic did not fit neatly into the prevailing narrative of a singular, race-based atrocity. So their stories were relegated to specialized studies rather than core curricula or mainstream media. Consequently, the experiences of these women have been too often treated as peripheral footnotes rather than integral chapters in the history of Nazi brutality. Yet failure to remember Ravensbrück's female victims represents a profound injustice. History is more than a catalog of past events. It serves as a warning for the future. By recalling the plight of these women, we gain deeper insight into the full scope of fascist terror, how unchecked totalitarian power can target bodies and minds through insidious, sustained cruelty. We also witness the indomitable resilience of those imprisoned who maintained solidarity, shared scarce resources, and silently resisted in everyday acts of compassion. Their collective defiance amid hunger, forced labor, and medical torture illuminates the astonishing capacity of human courage under the most dehumanizing circumstances. Remembering Ravensbrück is a shared responsibility. We must ensure that the haunting plea scrawled by a 12-year-old girl urging remembrance of both victims and oppressors, yet pleading that only the fruits we have borne through this suffering endure, does not dissolve into anonymous ashes. Her final words embody both a prayer and a moral challenge to honor suffering without indulging in bitterness, and to recognize courage born from despair. When we teach future generations about Ravensbrück, we do more than recount historical facts. We affirm the value of empathy, resilience, and collective memory. Let us commit to preserving the legacy of Ravensbrück's women in our textbooks, documentaries, and public discourse. Let us champion research into their lives, amplify their voices through survivor testimonies, and integrate their experiences into broader Holocaust education. Above all, let us pledge that no atrocity, however silent, however gradual, will ever be forgotten again. In doing so, we safeguard not only the memory of those who perished, but also the moral imperative that vigilant remembrance demands that we reject all forms of cruelty, affirm the dignity of the oppressed, and carry forward the lessons born amid Ravensbrück's darkest hours. The story of Ravensbrück is not only a tragic reminder of inhumane crimes, but also a guiding light for us today. First and foremost, it affirms the inviolable value of human dignity regardless of how extreme the hardship. Every individual deserves respect, protection, and the preservation of their human rights. When we look at the gaunt figures, the faceless statistics, and the 12-year-old girl's final prayer, we recognize the danger inherent in reducing people to objects rather than acknowledging them as full human subjects. Second, this documentary rekindles our faith in the power of solidarity and courage. Amid a living hell on earth, prisoners starving, diseased, and despairing still quietly shared food, shielded the lab rabbits, or bravely sent invisible ink letters to plead for help from the outside world. They showed us that small but steadfast acts can become shields for our comrades and sow seeds of hope in our own hearts. Third, the story demands that we remain vigilant against all forms of oppression, whether overt or covert, from the erasure of identity and the torment of forced labor to the brutality of medical experiments, every facet of Ravensbrück demonstrates how unchecked power can turn human beings into victims of its own machinery. Therefore, ethics, the rule of law, and a strong sense of social responsibility must always be upheld to prevent any drift toward tyranny. Finally, this video is a call to action for our generation. Do not let the memory of Ravensbrück fade into obscurity. Continue to tell the story of those brave women through history lessons, works of art, or simply conversations with your children and grandchildren. By safeguarding this memory, we not only honor the lives lost, but also keep alive a warning for the future that terror and discrimination can endure only while we remain silent. Through this journey, we learn that collective memory is our greatest bulwark in protecting freedom, justice, and human dignity for generations to come.